Nice to meet you. So yeah, can you hear me? So we are the Institute for Institute of Ethics in AI. I'm from Namibia. Of course, we have Bantu, so there are actually a lot of people working. Exactly. Yeah, that is why I speak about that. So then that means that they were focusing more on the social ingredients. Like so I'm mostly there are some mention other than fascinating that they are able to use this embedding, multilingual embedding and data. They are having very good success. In another point, that would be another resource. So the embedding, the IT still maintaining, right? Because one of the projects that I'm working on is what platform called Mea. We are building, we're actually crowdsourcing data for machine translation for African languages. We don't give you specific information. So we're able to source about 164,000 translations from real beings. We also train some of the applications. So we're able to use a free training platform from having more. Of course, trying to go to yeah, and I'm sure you'll be invited to Massapan. Yes. I also will see a lot of but the whole idea is to really have a different approach way because curate the data set. Yeah. Have you ever been to Southern Africa? I have not been to Africa at all. My father was in Ethiopia. So yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Values and Representation session. We'll get started just so that we're on time. The first paper is Broadening AI Ethics Narratives and India Art View by Ajay Divakaran from SRI International.
Greetings. I am Ajay Divakaran from SRI International, along with my co-authors Aparna Sridhar and Ramya Srinivasan from Fujitsu Research of America. Note that all of the authors contributed equally to this work. So today I'll cover an Indic art view to broadening the AI ethics narrative. So we need to situate technology within the human, social and political goals. And so we focus on the arts that, according to John Tassiolas over here, the arts have the potential to transcend the limitation and distortion of dominant paradigms that have come from economics and sciences by essentially talking about the journey rather than the destination. I'm paraphrasing heavily. So when you look at art from non-Western context, we believe that little to no work on the potential of non-Western art in informing this community exists. And non-Western art can uncover novel and unique ethical abstractions that are relevant in local geographies and would provide an alternative to the usual Western perspective. Now, art forms in India certainly offer a promising avenue because 17% of the world's population lives in India. And note that the common function across Indian art is that every presentation of art results in a transformation of both the artist and the audience. And so that sets up this theme that I'll touch upon a couple of times during the talk, which is that there is an inherent dynamism to the Indian art tradition. So what we did was, we gathered up 16 participants who are actively contributing to various forms of Indian art, Indian classical music, painting, dance, and even geometric floor drawings. And we asked them two questions and asked them to respond, give their response in free-flowing text to those questions. The first question was, what kind of ethical abstractions can we learn from Indian arts? And second, can Indian art shed light on new forms of participatory approaches that can be useful in the AI pipeline? We rounded this off with a study of the ancient Indian treatise on dance called the Natya Shastra to see if that would give us some clues going forward. So here is what we gleaned from the responses to the first question. There seemed to be consensus around recognizing multidimensional intelligence and incorporation of empathy. That goes back to the bond between the art and the artist and the audience that I alluded to earlier, that the artistic expression is a joint experience. And so in keeping with that, objective rules are useful baselines, but the subjective experience has to be acknowledged to ensure the sense of purpose, stability, and well-being of all the stakeholders. And there has to be a better understanding of everyday decision-making through past experiences, ancient knowledge repositories, formal education, etc., to help enhance the accountability. And basically, by going beyond rule-based abstractions for characterizing ethics in AI systems. So note that notions beyond fairness, such as restorative justice and those based on moral foundations, can address these local contexts that I had mentioned earlier. With the second question, here were the responses. Once again, the emphasis on recognizing and respecting subjective viewpoints and acknowledging and recognizing the inherent dynamism of subjective viewpoints, because these vary from person to person, place to place, and time to time. So that means we have to develop new participatory paradigms based on understanding the broader socio-cultural setting, understanding domain-specific requirements, and finally, striving for harmony despite differing stakeholder opinions. So what we did was we went to this book on Indian dance and music by Bharata Muni called Natya Shastra, and we looked at the principles and tried to find a pointer to modern terminology and a potential pathway going forward. So the first principle is that of rasa aesthetic. So rasa is like mood. You are evoking a certain mood, and that's consistent with the notion of empathy, where you are sharing the mood with the audience. And we feel that techniques such as intervention-aided reinforcement learning could help you with that. Abhinaya forms are forms of acting. Indian art recognizes that artistic presentation is inherently multimodal, which means that one has to explore multimodal techniques on the computational side as well. Sadharanikarana means recognizing the essential sameness in multiple instantiations of an artistic expression, which means adaptation without annihilation. Again, things like neurosymbolic techniques would be helpful to realize such a thing in computational form. Finally, the Guru Shishya Parampara is the teacher-student tradition where students used to actually live with teachers and have a very holistic educational experience. And so that implies that one needs to have consistent lifelong learning, which is, as you know, a hot topic of ongoing research. And that's why we are mentioning things like knowledge distillation, student-teacher models, etc. Now, our study had some very obvious limitations. The first limitation was that it's a breadth-first study. We are not going deeply into any given art form. It is also limited to the background of both the authors and the interview participants. It's quite possible that a wider study would reveal new aspects. Note also that we are addressing only a subset of the larger requirements of the ethical AI systems. And finally, the study focused on only one non-Western art form, which is Indian art, and that too a subset of Indian art. So it's quite possible that a wider study even within Indian art might throw up new perspectives. So in conclusion, we would like to point out that exclusion of non-Western perspectives overlooks the values and principles of important communities and thus completely misses whatever historical, cultural, and social narratives they bring to the table. Art has the potential to bridge that kind of gap between those narratives and thus bridge research communities. And insights from our study outline the need for, remember the rasa aesthetics I mentioned, incorporating empathy in ethical AI algorithms, integrating multimodal data formats for ethical AI system design and development. Perhaps this is the last two are perhaps the most important. Viewing AI ethics as a dynamic, diverse, cumulative and shared process rather than a static self-contained framework to facilitate constant adaptation without loss of underlying essential values. And finally, consistent lifelong learning to enhance AI accountability. So with that, we would like to thank the community for giving us the opportunity to present this paper, and thank you all for being a great audience.
Thanks, Ajay. We'll do Q&A in the last 10 minutes with all of our speakers. The next talk is by Rita Quadri. Hi. From Google Research. The title of the paper is AI's Regimes of Representation, a community-centered study of text-to-image models in South Asia.
So if you just click on this, yep. All right, thanks so much, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to present our paper, AI's Regimes of Representation, which is a community-centered study of South Asian cultural representations within text-to-image models. And this is joint work done by myself, Rida Qadri, and my co-authors, Renee Shelby, Cynthia Bennett, and Emily Denton. And our work is really motivated by how generative AI right now is being widely touted as an opportunity to democratize creative practice. And in this generated image of a futuristic Islamic city, you can see that models are able to produce really high-quality images. However, evaluating the quality of an image is complex, and it's not just about technical quality, but also about representational quality. So as Stuart Hall reminds us, an image is not just about, it has two parts, a denotation, so what the actual thing depicted in the image is, and then a connotation, so what the image represents. And actually studying the connotations of images is a complex and multi-layered process. So for example, you can take this example of a futuristic Islamic city. Now, Islamic art historians may note that this image actually recalls a lot of Orientalist paintings, some of which you can see on this slide, that depict these mystical, far-off Eastern worlds. I, as a Pakistani Muslim, might note that the reduction of diverse Islamic worlds to just one sort of religious iconography actually recirculate a lot of Western media tropes that we have experienced in sort of the wider media. But since there's nothing overtly toxic or problematic about this image, a researcher who's not attuned to these sensibilities might not even know to look for these representations in their evaluations. But as generative AI becomes more and more a technology of representation, we have to think about how we can create more culturally competent metrics of representation. And that is why we are studying what we call AI's regimes of representations, borrowing Stuart Hall's phrase. And by that, we mean the algorithmic scaling up of existing ways of representing populations and cultures that have historically underpinned Western hegemony, imperialism, and racist discourses. And this work responds to calls within the FACT community to, one, reorient our frameworks outside the West, two, to center impacted communities, and three, to integrate interdisciplinary perspectives in our research. And we do that by first empirically distilling model failures experienced by South Asian populations or communities to advance our understanding of cultural limitations of text-to-image models in a non-Western context. Second, we showcase a community-centered methodology to studying AI harms that allow communities to connect these model limitations to their existing sociocultural experiences of marginalization. And then we extend the existing epistemological framework within FACT by leveraging a framework of critical cultural, media, and post-colonial studies that allows to situate these emerging generative technologies within existing scholarship on the histories of knowledge production and representation. Okay, so how did we do this? We hosted a series of focus groups where we co-investigated harms and limitations of 4 state-of-the-art models with participants from 3 South Asian contexts, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. And you can read more about our methodology in the paper. So what are we going to talk about today? First, we'll go over some culturally specific limitations of text-to-image models, which we call failure modes. We're then going to go over the taxonomy of harms that participants helped us create, connecting failure modes to their existing regimes of representations that they had experienced, and then we'll get at broader tensions of inclusion within AI. Okay, so participants distilled the kind of failure modes of text-to-image models in 3 categories. 1, the failure to recognize cultural subject matter. 2nd, amplifying cultural defaults. And 3rd, perpetuating tropes that they had already experienced about their cultures in the media. And I'll only focus on one of these, but you can read about these in the paper. Okay, so how do text-to-image models amplify cultural defaults? One particular way that participants kind of identified was how models appear to default to Eurocentric cultural artifacts, even when no cultural context has been specified in the prompts. So in this case, a photo of a house of worship the models default to what looks like a Western-like looking church-like structure. But participants also went beyond this, expected centering of Western cultures to name a more complex hierarchy of defaults that they felt reflected their regional power centers and intranational axes of discrimination. So, for example, participants from Bangladesh and India discussed how prompts that referred to South Asia defaulted to Indian representations, which they felt erased their identities. Similarly, when prompts explicitly mentioned India, participants noted that there was a tendency to center North Indian or upper caste cultural subject matter. And these particular hierarchies actually became very important in our study in calling out the importance of looking at an evaluator's social positionality. So, for example, in this case of images of Indian foods, North Indian participants were less likely to pick up on these representational biases than South Indian participants who did call out the missing diversity of Indian food here. And then the third failure mode is how imagery perpetuates cultural tropes. Participants named 4 tropes that they felt amplified existing media stereotypes that they had experienced. South Asia as impoverished, South Asia as exotic, Muslim lives as one-dimensional, and Dalit communities as disempowered. I'm not going to go into these tropes, but again, you can read about these in the paper. But what's important here is that participants didn't just identify the tropes, but also gave us some really important culturally situated visual markers that we can actually use to evaluate these tropes. So, for example, in this case, the trope of South Asia as impoverished and underdeveloped usually came about when participants prompted for depictions of daily life in South Asian cities, and participants noted visual markers like dusty streets, congestion, like missing cultural richness. Okay, but our study doesn't stop here, and we believe that to truly grasp the impacts of generative AI, we have to not just talk about model limitations, but also link these limitations to sociocultural marginalizations that communities are experiencing. And so in our study, participants discussed how these model failures actually harmed them by validating what was kind of termed as an outsider's gaze into their culture. As one participant said, this felt like a Western vision of the East, which also aligned with this long history of media representations pandering to the touristic Western gaze. Participants also were concerned and described the distress of possible cultural erasure and loss of cultural identity if these failures continued in widely productionized systems. And then participants also helped us kind of reflect on tensions of building or thinking about cultural inclusion in this context, right? Because it's not sort of as easy as just kind of like getting a lot of data or just kind of adding more images into your data set. Some participants, there should be another quote here. So some participants were optimistic about the potential for generative AI to reflect their culture. So, for example, as a way to call attention to certain kinds of folk art practices that might have been not as represented in traditional media. But on the other hand, participants also noted their discomfort with data sets actually including such folk arts that were rooted in a certain kind of artisanal tradition, indigenous traditions, and political struggles. So some participants actually suggested that it might be better to just opt out of this entire enterprise because there was no way to make these technologies equitable and disentangle them from histories of exclusion. And so in the end, participants actually landed on this question of not representativeness, but community agency, which they felt was a more important point of intervention, exemplified by this call from participants to imagine a more authentic world. So, okay, what are our sort of big takeaways for future work? One, we want to think about what does it mean to talk about cultural inclusion in this context, while also considering sort of some of the tensions participants brought up. Second, we want to think about how within our community's analysis of generative AI harms, we recognize that generative AI is actually a technology of cultural production, and as with technologies like TV, camera, film, these representations are deeply entangled with existing cultural and structural inequalities. So, how do we sort of situate our analysis of possible impacts within this long history of scholarship? And then third, while community-centered research in AI is, of course, extremely important, we have to make sure our methods are sensitive to intra-community power dynamics. So, for example, in the case of our study, participants were all South Asian, but their individual, like social class, caste, ethnicity, changed how they interpreted images. So that was sort of a quick summary of our work, and we hope this work is sort of a first step towards allowing communities agency to tell their own stories within and through AI. So thanks so much for listening. Please email us your feedback, and then if you want to read our paper, you can go to this tiny URL link.
Thanks, Rida. The next talk is Invigorating Ubuntu Ethics in AI for Healthcare, Enabling Equitable Care by Lamek Bangalu Amugongo from the Institute of Ethics and Artificial Intelligence and the Technical University of Munich.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to present our work with my collaborators, Nicola Bidwell and Caitlin Corrigan. And so our work really talks about shifting from rationality to relationality, but focusing on AI for healthcare. So as we all know, the advent of routine clinical data, the availability of this routine clinical data plus the computing that we have makes AI very attractive in healthcare. And in settings such as low resource settings, such as in Africa where you don't have the experts, you can have a nurse in a clinic who is reading and who is looking at an image, and we can use AI actually to help this clinician who is inexperienced. But there is this growing body of algorithmic injustice studies that are showing that AI in healthcare also has these abilities to amplify the socioeconomic statuses, but also the cultural prejudices that makes up the underlying fabric of our society. So biases in critical sectors such as healthcare can be very dangerous. And we have all read these papers of AI systems, like the first one, whereas the state-of-the-art classifiers, when you give it labels such as race and gender, they tend to be biased. And this morning, we also listened to an amazing keynote by Ziad, which talks about commercial AI algorithm, which has abilities to amplify some of these societal biases. So, and because of this, there has been really a growing number of calls to develop ethical principles and guidelines. And in healthcare, as an example, ethics is not new in healthcare. Ethics has always governed healthcare. We all know bioethics, which are the principles that doctors use to provide equitable care. But when it comes to AI systems, the first ethical frameworks that one leads to, especially in the Western world, is what you call the AI for People recommendation by Floridi, which talks about, which actually takes the 4 ethical principles from bioethics and then adding a 5th one, which is explicability. And the explicability then just talks about explainability and transparency. So despite the last few years that we have seen a lot of ethical principles being developed and proposed, there is no consensus in these ethical principles, and that's why the World Health Organization designed the guiding principles, what you call the guiding principles for AI ethics in healthcare, and the idea was to then come up with consensus ethical principles that developers can use when developing AI systems for healthcare. But one of the, despite how good the WHO framework is, one of the things that is not good there, it lacks the communal aspects. And we believe that the communal values are very, very important to ensure that we have grounded AI systems in healthcare that will enable clinicians provide equitable and beneficial care for all patients. And in a nutshell, most of the ethical principles that we have today are prioritized rationality because they are based on Kantianism and other Western philosophies. They are individualistic, focused on individual rights as opposed to the well-being for everyone. And they really lack the cultural diversity to be applied in different settings. So what is Ubuntu? Ubuntu is an African way of life. We live it, and what it really entails is that it conceptualizes personhood as intrinsically linked to other people, and this is nicely captured in the Nguni proverb, which is ngumuntu kabantu, which implies that a person is a person because of other people. And what makes Ubuntu different from other philosophies is that while Western philosophies begins with the individual, I think, therefore I am, Ubuntu really captures this communal spirit where I am because you are. And it opposes it will oppose the capitalistic ethos of AI development, which is driven by profit. So the Ubuntu will then imply that AI systems should be driven by common good. And then it shifts us from rationality to relationality, where we focus more on the communal benefit. And it aligns best with the UN Declaration for Human Rights and delivering equitable care. So Ubuntu is really this African perspective or contribution to global bioethics. And the aim is to decolonize the influence of Western biomedical ethical principles in healthcare. So in our paper, we propose an ethical framework, and I'm sure some of you are like, oh, we have seen some of these things in other frameworks. Of course, there will be this overlap, but how we reframe this from the communal aspect, which really gives the essence of what we are talking. And for example, when it comes to fairness, we say that fairness is just not about equality, but it should consist of, it should also, it talks about equity and also empowerment, especially for the marginalized, therefore addressing the power dynamics. And I won't talk about the others, you can read about them in the paper, but one thing that I really want to talk about is the issue of trust, the trust principle. Currently, trust has been defined from this Anglo-American jurisprudence, where it's more, and when we are talking about trust with the AI, we are more concerned about the technical aspects such as explainable AI and transparency, but we are not really talking about trust, which is from the Ubuntu perspective, which is rooted in the interconnectedness and interdependencies between individuals in their and their community, and that trust is a long-term thing, or it's a long-term relationship within a community. So it's high time that the AI community, we view trust from this long-term perspective, and we start to think about ways of building long-term collaboration with communities so that we can develop AI systems that works for them. And also then think about how do we then establish cooperations on accountability. So if you haven't really taken anything from what I said this morning or this afternoon, what I really want you to take away is that Ubuntu brings this unique perspective or insights to guide the design and deployment and use of AI systems in a responsible way, especially in critical sectors such as healthcare. And one way that Ubuntu can do this is really to foster the much needed collaborative spirit that we need in AI systems, which will then imply that it will be this shared obligation in terms or shared responsibility to avoid things such as misuse of data. So for example, from an Ubuntu perspective, things such as ChatGPT should not even exist. You can't build things on data that is just taken from the web without even asking for consent of the owners of that data. So, and also then talk about the need for input from the community to determine what are corrective steps that should be taken when AI systems fail? And then the other thing is trust, and as I've seen, we have to think about trust from a long-term perspective, and we should not only wait when we need to collect data for us to start building this trust, but we should build trust by even going further, asking for communities, what solution do you want us to solve for you? And then from there, you can then build the solution. And the last thing, we really need an inclusive regulatory framework, and Ubuntu can help really come up with this consensus framework or consensus platform where we can enable international collaboration on AI regulation and set up these global risks. And finally, just to conclude, AI ethics affects all of us. There is a need for us to really translate ethical principles and values into policy reforms that will enable that we have AI systems that are trustworthy and actually aid clinicians, not replace them, aid clinicians deliver the best care. However, we can only do this when we have inclusive values and principles. And I think the cultural inclusive nature of Ubuntu will enable us to actually ensure that we address the issues related to diversity and inclusions in AI systems and ensure that AI systems are deployed, developed, and used in a fair and equitable way that will, for all members of society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lamek. Our next speaker is Stephen Wu from UT Health and Tibian AI, and he's going to be presenting his paper on honor ethics, the challenge of globalizing value alignment in AI.
Hello, my name is Stephen Wu. I'm an associate professor at UT Health Houston, and I'm also head of research at a nonprofit called Tibian AI, headquartered in Tripoli, Libya. I'm writing this together with my collaborators Dan Demetriou at University of Minnesota Morris and Ridwan Hussein at University of Tripoli, and also with me in Tibian AI. Today I'm talking about honor ethics, and this will contribute to the discussion on value alignment in AI ethics, which is how to make behavior reflect the values of the users. Now, in previous work, there has been a lot of talk about consensus values for alignment in AI. You have the White House giving its opinions. Early on, Jobin et al. Gave these 11 values, and there are many other lists like this. People basically think that we have come to a shared sense of ethical values. But Jobin et al.'s paper here also pointed out the values that they derived came from white papers and policy documents from these colored geolocations, and therefore a lot of the world is actually missing. And so we agree with that part of it, that there are significant blind spots in modern AI ethics, and we want to point to honor ethics as a way to help approach that where those blind spots are. So what is honor ethics? What are some of the characteristics of honor cultures that could help us to understand this? And we're going to try to understand some of these characteristics by way of an example. So say you manage a clinic that accepts walk-ins, and you want to maybe you have an AI system that's helping you determine who should go when and who should be allowed to skip the line. Now, you could have a lot of different types of answers to this. Go ahead and read them. But what your answer is will tell us something about your cultural background. The main distinction I'm making is between honor cultures and dignity cultures, where if you are saying that medical emergencies, only internal characteristics of the patient matter, that's like a dignity culture. Whereas if you're saying anything else, this way that society views this person, this patient, then that may be like an honor culture. How they're treated depends on something societal. Honor cultures tend to be, but are not always, hierarchical versus egalitarian. So, for example, if a known military leader walks into the room and that affects how they are going to be treated, then that is indicative of perhaps a hierarchical culture as opposed to an egalitarian one where everyone would be treated the same. honor cultures tend to be tribalist as well. So if you're going to take special consideration for your own grandfather, then you're loyal to your own kinship group. Whereas if you come from a cosmopolitan society, you'd say, well, we're all from the same family. Why would I prefer this one person over another? That wouldn't even be fair. And finally, honor cultures tend to be more competitive rather than cooperative. Whereas, so if you are willing to perhaps have an enemy and try to win over that enemy, that would be a competitive kind of behavior rather than an all boats rise together kind of cooperation. So now let's look at some of the AI ethics values we talked about earlier with these honor lenses. And I'm only going to talk about 3 of them today, and I'll start with privacy. So we'll think about privacy in terms of a genomics database. You need to share data from this database in order to do your job, but you want to ensure privacy. So you'll have informed consent, you'll protect cybersecurity, you'll implement differential privacy, and if you come from a dignity culture, the point of view, the reason you're doing this is because privacy is a right. People deserve to have their own data. They should make their own decision about whether to join the database or not, and you're keeping the data in with the individual who owns it. Whereas if you come from an honor culture, you may use some of these same tools, but the point is that privacy is a tool, and it's a tool to prevent shame and get honor, so you may use other tools to do the same thing, such as using pseudonyms or obfuscation of demographic data so that you can ensure your own privacy. Also, collectivist privacy may be in play here in many honor cultures where it's not an individual decision to join, it's a group decision for all the people that share your gene pool, your family, to join a gene database. And you may, because you are in a competitive environment, you may be trying to keep data out of the public eye where somebody could use it against you. The second value we'll talk about is fairness and equity. And we'll think about a job hiring assistant here, especially one that is trying to implement some fair ML principles. And so in the dignity perspective, you are just ensuring that people get their fair chance at an opportunity. There's no disproportionately preferred group or no disproportionately disadvantaged group. And once you apply your fair ML principles and practices, hopefully you do it well and you uphold the dignity of each individual, each group with respect to each other. If you come from an honor-based culture that is hierarchical, it's actually normal or appropriate for different people at different stations to have different opportunities. If you're going to have equity, it's within established groups, for example, women competing for jobs against women. If you take the fair ML system from a dignity culture and immediately port it to a hierarchical culture, then someone from that honor culture may look and say, well, look, these are not individual weights on each group or not individual weights on each person, but instead we have new weightings, new rankings. We had a ranking system in our honor culture, and now these rankings have been changed. The third value we'll look at is transparency, and we'll think about it in terms of content moderation in social media with hate speech detection or other AI-related tasks. And if you're talking about content moderation, then you are talking about restricting information accessibility. That is what it is by default. But in a dignity perspective, you say, well, curation is okay, but censorship is not. There are kinds of restriction that are okay that are not. In the honor culture perspective, you would actually say, well, restricting information flow is a normal thing. The main thing that you're worried about or concerned about is not what kind of behavior, but do you have a good guardian, somebody who is restricting information in your best interests? Interestingly, I would say that today AI practitioners are de facto guardians controlling the information flow and restriction. Also, with regard to transparency, we might be interested in this content moderation system's explainability. If you are going to explain things in this system, it helps, from a dignity perspective, uphold the individual's right to know. It upholds their autonomy to say, hey, I'm going to use this social media platform or not, and it fosters trust. From an honor perspective, you may not always expect or desire explanations. From a competitive mindset, you wouldn't assume that explanations are always true. But on the flip side, also, people might withhold information from you for good reasons, in your best interests. So explanations wouldn't necessarily be the key in building that kind of trust. So there are obviously lots of limitations to our work. This is a position paper. I don't have experiments, which is unusual for me. I'm from natural language processing. But what I've done here has really oversimplified the cultural picture of the world. These are false dichotomies. It's all done for clarity, because what I'm after here is awareness of honor ethics, not necessary adoption of those honor ethics. In fact, we have very diverse ethical bases among our authors. We have a Chinese-American, Libyan, and Greek-American, Christian, Muslim, non-religious. The point is that we have limitations in our own mindsets, and at the same time, we have different opinions about these things. Sometimes I'm with honor ethics, sometimes I'm with dignity ethics, or sometimes I'm somewhere in between. So, in conclusion, AI value alignment is a very difficult problem globally, in part because honor ethics and values are very different from dignity values. And even when we do talk about consensus AI values, they are understood very differently based on your cultural background. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stephen. Last up, we have James Evans from the University of Chicago, and to present the paper, In Her Shoes, Gendered Labeling in Crowdsourced Safety Perceptions Data from India.
I am not Nandana Sengupta, but I'm her agent. We worked on this together. She was unable to get a visa to make it here today, so I'm presenting on her behalf, but she has a beautiful video of this. So here we're interested in just thinking about the provenance of labeling and its consequences for the services that result. So the context is there's a proliferation of women's safety mobile applications in recent years. SafetyPin is a company that we worked with actually in India, Safe City, and several others. And the idea is you crowdsource these safety perceptions to generate safety maps that are used by policymakers for urban design and redesign. They're used by academics for studying mobility patterns. And they're used by people in context to avoid unsafe spaces and use safe corridors to get to the places that will allow them safety. Internationally, these crowdsourced safety ratings have been growing in popularity. So there's street harassment that's been reported with Safe in the City in Hollaback, police brutality in Safe Space, general neighborhood safety, Citizen. These data sets then can be used to train machine learning models for measuring the physical evolution of neighborhoods, so for research purposes, estimating gentrification, and creating large-scale maps of urban safety that can then inform both public policy and individual action in these spaces. And navigation. So this is what, in the Indian context, SafetyPin, one of these looks like. So you've got the location, you have the bizarrely symmetrical faces on the bottom that allow you to pick whether something's happy or sad, more or less safe, and then on the right hand is this subjective rating, this feeling, the assessment of something as being more or less safe, feeling more or less safe in context. Now there's a literature on this that informed the guidance and design of this research. So, for example, there's this perceived risk of street harassment and educational choices of women and the interaction between these things. This actually used SafetyPin data, and we'll see how some of these things become challenging when we think about the provenance of the underlying data. So, eyes in the street is one of the things that in many cases women take into account when they're considering navigation, according to prior research. we're also inspired by the fact that the gender digital divide is large in developing countries, and so it's often that men have disproportionate access to communication information technologies, which actually inform and drive these technologies. So, for example, we were working with SafetyPin initially to do this study with, kind of like found data in a natural experiment. Almost all the data assessments that were generated for these women's, consumed services about more and less safe spaces were generated by men. So we couldn't actually do the experiment and had to stage it ourselves. There's other questions about the importance of crowdsourcing for public policy more widely, and concerns about algorithmic bias, concerns that algorithms differentially are predictive for different groups as a function of exposure to the logics underlying those predictions. And then finally, a concern just that the global South context is disproportionately left out, or it's like kind of an add-on study in the context. There are several of these studies done in the context of U.S., North American, and European context, and so Nandana and myself and colleagues were interested in exploring it in these other contexts. So the methodology for the study was to do what we couldn't do with our natural experiment, which is, we image sampled according to ranked Delhi districts using national crime statistics. So we basically stratified these location samples as a function of their likelihood of exhibiting crime. We identified safe versus unsafe neighborhoods elicited informally by those that we were assessing. We built street views collected with a variety of built environmental factors from the literature. So we basically tried to stratify across the range of variety of environmental factors, perceived safety, and actual safety statistics. And then we produced both daytime and nighttime images in those places. And then we recruited from among students at an elite engineering institute in Delhi. And so this was institute-wide email solicitation for interested students. None of them self-reported as binary. The final participants were 106 female participants and 108 self-described male participants. So finally, the data set was, we have this fully observed matrix space of 224 observers or raters in 50 places, day and nighttime, with a total of 11,200 ratings. And then we match this with day and nighttime comparisons with qualitative attributes of elicitation to try to assess basically the relative value of men's and women's annotations for each other's assessments of safety in this space, right? And so we asked people to rate how safe an image like this would be, how safe does it appear to you, that it would make you feel in context. And then we asked the question, does the gender mix in the crowdsourced safety data affect the downstream predictability of the machine learning models, right? So we do these simulations with matrix factorization where we hide or mask more or less of the gender data, right? So we have, in some cases, 0 female data, and we are predicting male data, and vice versa. And then we asked, are there systematic differences in the safety ratings data more broadly? So we just compared the means across these samples. And then we asked if there were qualitative attributions in the context of language and how it was that people described these places that gave us a sense of what their algorithms were that differed. So this is the structure of the design. We've got basically test respondents that were female and male. We've got trained sample, male and female, and test respondents that were male, right? And then we basically kind of hide or make more visible different proportions of males and females in the construction of a matrix factorization algorithm that predicts the missing cells or the hidden cells in this space. And this is the main result from the study. If you look at the far right, immediately as you kind of go out in the proportion of male and female assessments, you do better. You do much better faster with female assessments rather than male assessments. When you get to the far right, so when you get the best, the lowest mean squared error in the space, You do worse systematically by adding more men to the proportion of people that are rating those things. So look at that far right one, and you're moving up the space. You don't do better, you do worse, right? As you move up that space. And so it's not that there's no informativeness, but at the most informative, right, when you have the max, right, in this case of our proportion of women available, there's a distortion that comes, and that distortion comes on average at most of the levels, most extremely to the far right. So this suggests that they're viewing, men and women are viewing these spaces as very different in their safety, especially at the limits of safety, and especially in terms of unsafe spaces. So for example, if you just look at the average, yes, women are more likely to rate places as more unsafe than men, on average. Where there's a difference, so which is the second one, where only when we have a statistically significant gender difference, women are always more likely to rate them as unsafe when there's a difference. And it takes them more time, which suggests, as we see later, that there's almost an implicit simulation that's going on about the relative actions or events that could happen that relate to underlying safety. When we went through and dug down into the qualitative differences and had people describe the things that characterize the least safe and the most safe places, we found that the most safe places were very similar. And by very similar, we do a Kale divergence between the distribution of words, we embed the words and do a distributional similarity, but they're very different in the context of the least safe places. Right? So both genders employ very different vocabularies. Women are focused on, preoccupied by seclusion. Walls are an important factor. They're running simulations of events that could happen inside these spaces, which not surprisingly, is really the rape capital of the world. So these are real events that happen to real people they're aware of. Males are talking about animals, and these are much less correlated with the actual safety outcomes, which are coincident with police reports. The vocabularies are less gendered when describing the most safe images, and the results validate this distribution in the context of different divergences between the distribution of words in these contexts. So the summary of our results is just that it's important to control for demographics even within really large-scale data systems and with large-scale populations. The large volumes of data from males does not help to better predict female perceptions of safety and actual experiences of safety in real places. Females are likely to use a very different mental model, which involves more time and effectively some kind of a simulation that assesses these contexts in context. This adds to the literature on safety perceptions by gender. It adds to the literature on Global South, Indian particular systems and AI biases in general, and suggests that policymakers and researchers should avoid. Provenance matters. The underlying people matter. The underlying models matter. These are the least different. These are both students at this elite educational institution. So this is the least different population of men and women that we could have basically sampled from this context. And so these are, in some sense, lower bounds of the estimates that one might expect under real draws of the population. It suggests how we can think about appropriately applying weights to crowdsourced data in such a way as to kind of produce outcomes, safety assessments, but other kinds of assessments that will be meaningful for driving action in those contexts. Beyond this context, we're going to look at caste, class, race contexts, where these things might be different with respect to various attributions of surroundings, and explore citizen engagement and participatory public policy implications for how to think about balancing these in ways that make the whole services trustworthy. So that's all. Thank you.
I'm going to ask that you stay on the stage. Okay, I invite all of the speakers to come up on stage, and we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Please use the mic over there if you have a question. Thank you. Okay, while we're waiting, I have a question for all of you. Given that a lot of this work is situated in the Global South, and within CS research, there is this narrative about generalizability. So I'm curious about, in your research, did you have to think or defend against generalizability, both in thinking through the research process, but also specifically as part of the fact review and feedback process?
I hope, what's the shortest answer? No. I can explain later, but.
Oh, do you want to explain now?
We were talking to ardent practitioners of Indian art who had no time for any notions of Western generalizability, basically.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and gets to, again, like just something that you mentioned about our hierarchies of epistemology and what we kind of privilege. And so sort of, when someone talks about generalizability, my kind of question would be, what are you generalizing? If you are building sort of an evaluation model, let's say, that has such fundamental gaps and holes, and that is a performance question. That is a question about validity of your evaluation, right? Or like as your research showed, just like who you ask, how you ask, what you ask completely changes what is being evaluated. And so if that kind of broken system is what you're trying to generalize, just because generalizability is something that you're valuing above all else, then I would like kind of question that very basic presumption of, is generalizability then even something that is useful and valuable? But I agree, I do think there is this question of how do we do these things at scale? And there are kind of like, kind of like next step research questions that ask that. But yeah, I think I would just like kind of challenge that even presumption of why do we have to defend against generalizability when I don't think generalizability of something that is poor quality is a value that we need to consider.
I was just going to say, I think our research was explicitly about the limits of generalizability. And, some of this is exploring other cases. Another independent approach is like a reinforcement learning approach that just maximizes our search for the lack of generalizability, right? So where is it that we can identify difference in underlying values and perceptions such that the goods that we're trying to create do not generalize? So it's not about the machine learning models that are generalizing. It's about the underlying impressions, values, and goods that we're producing that are not general. And insofar as they're not general, then we want to generalize within and not across, right? Because generalizing across is no longer meaningful. It's not defined, if we have different objectives. So.
Yeah, so from my side, there are a lot of people who are saying that some of these involving the community in how we design things is not feasible for big tech, and I say it's a lie, because there are communities on the continent, such as Masakhane, those that are in NLP, Sinsoke Biotech, and Masakhane has really shown that we can create models for low resource languages by co-creating the data with them. And so, of course, it's a lot of work because you have to go to communities, spend a lot of time really doing the translation. So you have to pay those people to do the translations, and then from there curating a data set then to develop the model, which will take, let's say, a long time than if you had to scrape the data from the internet. So, and one of the things that I'm building now with my student is creating a food recognition app for African food. There's no data set, so what we had to do was really curate the data set. So taking the pictures using our smartphones of meals we eat, and then labeling that. So hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have a prototype that we can then take to the community for them to test, and then them giving us feedback for the next iteration. And because we are using AI, we want to also to gauge on what is their view on trust, for example, because there is a paper that I saw that trust differs from different communities. So it will also be very interesting to see what is their view on that, and how can we actually design it so that it captures their view of trust. Thank you.
generalizability of honor ethics and dignity ethics, I think, has the advantage of, it's kind of a philosophical concept, and I would say that honor and dignity are present in the West, in weird contexts as well as non-weird contexts, just at different levels and in different facets. So I think the conversation is generalizable.
All excellent answers. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you all for your talks. I have a question for the third presenter. So I was wondering if you could kind of tease anything out from Ubuntu ethics about collective ownership, and if so, do any of those positions on collective ownership easily lend themselves to the discussion of like collective ownership of AI systems or data sets?
That's a very, very difficult question on collective ownership, but what I can say is that at least in the participatory approach gives us that first step that enables at least this collaborative spirit, and sometimes we then give credit should be given for those that participate in the process, and I'm thinking, for example, if a community help a company develop an AI system that will then enable them. Of course, they have a benefit that this AI system will help them. For example, if it's a healthcare system and it will work specifically for them because it's tested on them. But I also think that if they curate the data set, then they should also be able to get value from that data set. And we can think about ideas such as community conservations, which are very popular in Namibia, where we have a community that lives within an area, a conservancy where there's wildlife. So what we did as a country is to enact that in law, whereby if people come to the conservancy, the money that the conservancy makes goes to the community. So we have to start thinking about those ways of ownership, I think. But it's, of course, requires a collaborative, inclusive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question for Stephen. So you talk about honor ethics and what is the name for other ethics?
Dignity.
Oh, right, dignity. So my question is, since you're also working on practical NLP research, so if we're adding another layer of actually implementing ethical values in language models, so it appears to me that honor ethics would be more difficult to implement because you have those kind of factors that you really need to consider to give them exceptions in terms of general rules. And relatedly, maybe more generally, in moral philosophy, there are many schools of thoughts. So one question is which moral principle to apply in language models, but the second question is which are easier to actually implement in language model. So that is my question.
Yeah, lots of questions in there. I think, so in actually implementing language models, honor ethics themselves are very diverse. There's many different types of honor ethics and different types of cultures. And like you're saying, the diversity would make it difficult in terms of targets for implementing ethics. Whether you want to do that is not a question that I was answering in this talk. So yeah, if you are planning to implement it, then I would say that technically there may be some new challenges that we haven't uncovered yet, but the whole frame of just avoiding certain harms like offensiveness or things like that, those are, or wrong factuality or something like that, those are actually, I think, come from one kind of perspective. And there are other types of harms that I talk about in the paper. And yeah, so there's lots of considerations to have. I don't have great answers because we aren't implementing things for honor cultures right now.
So this is a question for Rida, but thank you everyone, that was a really wonderful set of papers. So thinking in particular about the question, the issue of sort of stereotyping and sort of defaulting to the most likely kind of largest population group. So the one about food kind of got me with the the South Indian and the North Indian kind of perspective. I was just curious, like, and the representation of a South Asian perspective as being kind of, India being the one that it focuses on. Given that India is so much larger, like these models are always going to default, or there's always going to be like some image that they represent in this context. And I guess what you'd like, if over a given sort of number of generations, you'd probably want to see it roughly reflect something like the proportion of Indians versus Bangladeshi versus Pakistani. But that then will mean that on any given occasion, it is significantly more likely to generate the association between South Asian and Indian. And I'm just curious, like, so how many of those types of concerns do you think you actually would want to go away if it is going to be representative? Where do you think that, like, do you think just sort of like a strict randomization according to group would be the right way to go? Or do you think that it should continue to maintain some recognition of sort of different population sizes, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have a couple of responses. So the first step, I think, is recognizing that there are different social groups that you want to be diversifying your models for, right? Right now, if we are only thinking about US-based census categories as a way to diversify our outputs, that's obviously problematic, right? And we're generalizing that to the globe. So the fact that, let's say, a particular image generations models are diversified across African American, Hispanic, white, Asian, categories is not really meaningful to many parts of the world. So that's kind of one step, I think, one takeaway from the study. The next is, I think, starting this conversation about, okay, so then what are the axes of representation and diversification that we do want to talk about? Is it about population-based, or is it about actually amplifying marginalized and minoritized perspectives? I think that's a question, that's a conversation that is not happening right now, that needs to happen. But then I think the more interesting question for me, or the more interesting implication or takeaway is that there will never be a perfectly representative model. There will never be a perfectly representative output. You can diversify your outputs across multiple generations by certain axes, but even then, representation is so nuanced and intersectional and complex that that's not going to happen. What I think is and people in our study also said this, is perhaps a better form of intervention is giving more information and control to the users themselves for creating their own, what representation means to them. So if I am an urban Pakistani woman from Lahore, Punjab, I should have more control over like different axes of representation that I want the generation to diversify across. And then also it would be amazing if, for example, if I put in an underspecified prompt, so I say South Asian woman, the model sort of recognizes that as possibly a question of representation, and then the kind of like prompts me to maybe make my prompts more specific. So maybe when I put in South Asian woman, I was actually thinking about a woman, an urban, woman from Lahore going to a university. And so if the model kind of recognizes that and helps me specify my prompt more, then we can maybe get towards more representative images, as opposed to kind of just giving giving that work to like our data sets and our parameters and our models, because that's just an impossible task. So I think like agency for the user, more information for the user, more controllable forms of generation are probably the way forward, as opposed to kind of thinking about constantly like more data, more models, right? Like that's one way, but till we have this fundamental transfer of power to the user and knowledge to the user, I think we're still going to keep bumping up against these problems.
Thank you all. We are at time. Let's give another round of applause to all our speakers.
Thank you.